And now, a story from the Appleseed.
So my buddy Skeeter and I were in a water bar in New York City. You heard me. I said a water bar. This was a bar that served nothing but water. And the way we got there is, we were however old we are now. I'm not saying, because you're going to be playing this for decades. And we were in New York City, and we met up with some young 20-ish, 30-ish hipster New York people. And they wanted to take us to do something in New York that we couldn't do in our little town of Half Dollar, West Virginia. So they took us to a water bar. Now, this bar served nothing but waters from famous rivers and lakes, and you could order. Kids were ordering things like heavy Norwegian fjord water with April Lake Huron ice dusted with the snows of Mount Kilimanjaro. And one kid said that he wanted a re-evaporated jet contrail from the wing of a 737 passing southbound over the Iberian Peninsula. And then the waitress would ask follow-up questions like left wing or right wing, because everything's political these days. And then she looked at me and she said, "What would you like?" And I thought about saying something kind of smart alecky, but then I thought to myself, you know what, this lady, she didn't invent the water bar. She just works here. She's putting herself through school. She's a mother. She wants to be an actress on Broadway. She doesn't need me to be a smart aleck. So I said, "What would you recommend?" And she said, "Maybe you would like some re-evaporated Old Faithful mist." And I thought I would not. So I said, I'm from West Virginia. Do you have any West Virginia waters? She said, "We have water from the Green Sulphur Springs, the White Sulphur Springs, and the Berkeley Springs." Well, I didn't want sulfur water, and I've had Berkeley Springs water. So I said, "No, let me ask you this. Do you have any West Virginia geyser water?" And she said, "Sir, I don't think there are geysers in West Virginia." And I said, "Sure there are." And she said, "No, I don't think that the magma is close enough to the crust." And I thought, that is not the response that I had expected. And I said, "As a matter of fact, we do have geysers in West Virginia. It's got nothing to do with magma." I said, "Just like under the great city of New York, there's a labyrinth of subway tunnels going back and forth in every direction." I said, "Under the entire state of West Virginia, there's just a warren of coal mines. And sometimes those coal mines catch on fire, and they're really hard to put out because they have literally tons and tons of fuel to burn. And a lot of times they just seal the mine up and hope the fire goes out. They call that a coal seam fire." I said, "There have been coal seam fires going on all around the world, some of them for centuries." And I could see those kids, those young people I was with, they were trying to be polite, but their thumbs were twitching, because they had right there in front of them what Andy Alfred Irwin calls their verification machines. And it's so much harder to lie these days, You gotta throw in some facts. And I said, "No." I said, "Go ahead, search engine it." I said, "Check out Centralia, Pennsylvania. It's had a coal seam fire burning underneath of it since 1962. And boom, those kids were on their phones and they were all tickety, tickety, tickety. And finally, one of them goes, "There is such thing as coal seam fires." And another kid goes, "There has been a fire underneath Centralia, Pennsylvania since the 1960s. They were burning some rubbish at the dump, and a hole opened up in the ground, and the burning rubbish fell into a coal mine. They had to abandon the entire town." And I felt vindicated. And the waitress looked at me and said, "Well, it's still, they didn't say anything about West Virginia geysers." And I said, "Yeah, that's because they're really hard to document." I said, "Because what happens is we have these coal seam fires, and sometimes it rains really, really hard. And when it rains that hard, some of that water makes it all the way down to the mines, and it drips into those burning mines. And as soon as the water drips into those mines, it turns to steam. And when that steam builds up enough in those mines, you'll just get an explosion. You'll just get a geyser out in the middle of nowhere. It's not even going to happen twice, but, people have seen them." And she said, "Well, we don't have any West Virginia geyser water." And I said, "Then bring me whatever you think I'd like." And she turned to Skeeter, and I could tell she didn't want to ask him what he wanted. She said, "What could I get you, sir?" And he said, "You know what would you recommend?" And she said, "How about a nice cocktail of Loch Ness, Lake Baikal water with responsibly harvested Greenland glacier ice infused with Persian rose water. And maybe Skeeter actually misunderstood her, or maybe Skeeter deliberately misunderstood her. But what he said was, hose water? He said, don't infuse it with hose water. He said, bring me a whole glass of hose water. And that poor young waitress just went white. And she said, sir, we don't serve hose water. She said, hose water is dangerous. It's got toxins, chemicals, bromine. It can mess up your livers and kidneys. And Skeeter looked at me and he said, me and this guy, we were raised on hose water. And she said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, listen, when we were like 12 years old, we had a fort off in the woods, maybe a mile off in the woods. We had this fort, and in case we robbed a bank or something, we needed to go hide out. We built it with 2x4s and a tin roof, took a couch out there. The only trouble was we didn't have any water, because this was before you could carry water conveniently. You had to have it running, or you were going to die. And so we needed a way to get water an entire mile. So we went back to our house, as Skeeter said. He said, my family had a hose, but it wasn't a mile long. But Bill's family had a hose, and we screwed the two of them together, and they still weren't a mile long. But then we only lacked about 5,180 feet of hose. And by this time, everybody in the bar was listening, because Skeeter was talking loud, but also, you know, sound travels over water. We'll edit that laugh in, because that is a good joke. So we decided what we were going to do is we would just borrow some of the neighbors' hoses. Now, operating under the principle that not everyone was going to be willing to loan us their hose for an indefinite period of time, Skeeter and I decided to borrow the hoses without asking. So we went to all of our neighbors and we borrowed their hoses, and then we had about 3/4 mile of hose. And we connected it to a spigot behind a barn in Skeeter's neighbor's yard, and we started to haul 3/4 mile of hose out into the woods. Now, it was heavy, because that's a lot of lead. And it was July, so we were sweating, and pretty soon we were thirsty. And we finally got to the end of that 3/4 mile hose. Now, we were still a 1/4 mile short, but that's better than a mile. And we thought, man, it'd be good to have a drink. And that's when we realized that we hadn't turned the hose on. So we had to walk all the way back, turn the hose on, then walk all the way back to get a drink. And after that, we resolved we were never going to forget to turn that hose on. But we didn't have like a nozzle to put at the end. So when we were done, we just tied in a knot like that. And it didn't slow the water completely, but it was just a trickle. But that way, we always had water. And Skeeter stopped talking. And he looked at me like it was my turn. And I thought a little scripture would be useful here. So I said, Proverbs 9:17, stolen water always tastes sweeter. And Skeeter said, especially through a stolen hose. And I said, we also had a goat out there. So we had a goat, because we had a lot of bramble, a lot of like blackberry bushes, a lot of thorns and stuff. And those are hard to clear unless you have a goat, because goats will eat anything. You put a goat out there, clear it in half a day. I said we borrowed the goat at night from Angus Fester. Angus Fester was this mean old dairy farmer in town. He loved cattle so much that he had named all of his children after different breeds of cattle. So there was Angus Jr., there was Holstein, Hereford, Guernsey, and Jersey. Hereford and Guernsey were the twins, which doesn't make any sense. That's a geography joke. Look it up later. And then when Helen, his wife, finally had a daughter, she knew that Angus was going to name the poor girl after a breed of cow, so she said, at least make it sound feminine. And that's where Charlotte Fester got her name. But anyway, I said, we borrowed that goat from Angus Fester, and we took him out, and he would just, walk around and eat all the bramble. And then when the goat got thirsty, he'd just walk over and drink out of the hose. And those kids were like, you drank out of the same hose as a goat? And I was like, the goat didn't mind. And so I said, and then I said one time, we got done out there and we went home and we were 12. And when you're 12, what was very interesting yesterday is not interesting today. And so it might have been more than a week since we'd been out to the woods, and we were down there at the crossroads there in Half Dollar, and we were listening to an argument going on between Sheriff Hasbro, who was the law in our community. Sheriff Hasbro was the chief of police when he was 18 years old. But at that time in West Virginia, you had to be 21 to buy bullets. So his mom would have to go to the store with him to buy bullets. Eventually, he became sheriff. Wonderful, wonderful man. Sheriff Hasbro was arguing with Angus Fester. And Angus Fester was saying, Sheriff Hasbro, somebody stole my goat. And I don't think you're doing enough about it. And Sheriff Hasbro said, Fester, how am I supposed to worry about one goat when there are 380 garden hoses just gone missing? And Angus Fester said, do you think the two crimes are connected? And Sheriff Hasbro said, what would a goat have to do with 3/4 mile of garden hose? And at that moment, Skeeter and I were kind of backing out of town. But then we heard a whistling sound coming out of the sky, like a bomb. And we looked up, and a goat was descending, and it hit the ground with kind of a splat. It gets worse. And everybody turned and looked at me and Skeeter. Now, young people especially, I don't want to tell you how to live your lives, but I do want to tell you this, that if you were standing somewhere, anywhere, and a goat falls out of the sky, and everybody just assumes that you had something to do with it, you're living right. So, the goat fell out of the sky, and after the autopsy, well, it didn't take long for Sheriff Hasbro to figure out what had happened. And I just stopped talking. And everybody looked at me because they wanted to know, but they didn't want to ask. And the waitress especially didn't want to ask. But then finally, magnanimously, on behalf of everyone else, she said, well, what did happen? And I said, well, okay, first of all, the goat didn't really splat. I may have underdescribed how the goat landed. I said the goat landed in such a way that an autopsy was unnecessary. Which is a fun thing to say to a bunch of New York 30-year-old vegans. I said, we could see everything that had been in the goat. And right there was about 18 inches of knotted garden hose. And so Sheriff Hasbro went and started walking through backyards, and pretty soon he came across that garden hose that was connected to the spigot in Skeeter's neighbor's yard, and he followed the 3/4 miles out. And I guess what had happened was that goat had gotten thirsty because we'd neglected him for a week, and he'd finally just chewed off the end of that garden hose so he could drink whenever he wanted. And while all that water running out of that hose had seeped down into the ground underneath a burning coal mine that was just underneath that goat, and when it exploded, it had sent that goat all the way to town. And the waitress said, well, we still don't have any West Virginia geyser water. And I said, you know what, just surprise us. She came back a few minutes later, and she handed my drink, and she handed Skeeter his drink, and he took a sip, and he said, oh, this is good. He said, is this Persian rose water? And she said, no. That's New York City public restroom dirty mop water.
Thanks for joining us for a story from the Appleseed.